I'm Catherine Turcer with Common Cause Ohio, and today we are going to talk about Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. Now, I think a lot of us spend a lot of time thinking about the Constitution, and especially today thinking about, due process and all sorts of different areas of the U.S. Constitution. And I have to say, one of my favorite t-shirts just says, "We the people." Um, We'll give it just a minute. I expect folks will be coming in very soon. For those of you who are here, welcome, welcome. And then I'm going to encourage you to put your name into the chat and where you're from. And then we have a Q&A box. So like if you have questions that come up, pop them into the question and answer box. And what will happen is Jessica Dickinson from the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance will take them and put them into a doc so that I will be sure to ask your questions. Now, I will highlight that we can't actually get to every single question, unfortunately, but we will do our best so that when you walk away from this, you better understand what Article 5 is, what the threat is, and then what you can do about it. And with that, I'm noticing people from all over Ohio. I'm just really glad that so many of you are here. I'm noticing a Dayton, and I saw Westlake, I saw Martins Ferry, Shaker Heights. I just wanted to say thank you. Welcome. I'm Catherine Turcer from Common Cause Ohio, and I'm glad that you're here today. We're going to talk about Article 5. And, we have had legislation, at the State House calling for an Article 5 convention, probably for 10 years. It's, what makes this year different is that there were 3 hearings in a row in the Ohio Senate. And then we had some visitors from out of state that Ron DeSantis, for example, that made me a little bit worried that there was real pressure on legislators to actually pass an Article 5 convention. And that's why we're here today. If you'll go to the next slide, I did want to say a special thank you to the sponsors. You'll notice that we have ACLU Ohio, we have the American Constitution Society, the Columbus chapter. We have, of course, the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance, the Ohio Women's Alliance, Save Ohio Parks, and a big thank you also to the Sierra Club Ohio chapter. Now, one of the things we're going to do today is focus a little bit on the possible impacts of the environment. Now, I'm going to encourage you all to use the chat, add your name and where you're from if you haven't done it already. I'm going to ask you to put your questions into the Q&A. And so this is the agenda. It's pretty simple. We'll start with Viki Harrison. She's going to do this overview of Article 5, just so that we're all on the same page. Then we're going to hear from a wonderful professor, David Super, is that the best last name? Who's going to walk us through all of the kind of the history of the call for an Article 5 convention. Who's behind it? This will be another opportunity for us to kind of take a deeper dive, thinking about kind of some of the pressure that's kind of been ongoing and why they might want to actually have an Article 5 convention. Then we're going to segue over to Franklin, who's going to talk about the environment. And because Professor Super spent some time thinking about this as well, they're going to engage in a conversation, and then all of us will talk about Article 5 and what it means. And this is your opportunity to throw in your questions. I need questions to ask them. And then at the very end, we'll talk about, well, what can you actually do? How can you take action? We'll provide some resources. I did want to remind everybody that one of the things that we do is we send a follow-up the next day. So Jessica Dickinson from the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance is going to be sending you a follow-up that will have information that is mentioned this evening, and also, ways to take action. And if you have questions, just, send an email back. Let us know what your questions are, because this is like an onion. You start to unwrap things and you get further and further on and realize that you actually have more and more questions. And with that, I would like to introduce Viki Harrison. Now, Viki Harrison is with Common Cause, and her focus at Common Cause is on Article 5 and on dissent. So she's all things Constitution and then protecting our right to protest, protecting our right to dissent. I think it's just incredibly important. Before that, she was actually a Common Cause state director, much like me. She was in New Mexico. And also, she at one point was kind of my boss. And so I'm very happy that Viki is here today to talk about Article 5. And with that, Viki Harrison, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And while I was on a team that could have been her boss, I was never lucky enough to be Catherine's boss. We all fought over like who gets Ohio. Okay. Thank you so much for that, Catherine. And thanks everybody for being here to hear about Article 5, because let's talk about it. I mean, it's wonky. It's something we've never really talked about. It's something people don't talk about. And so it is a direct threat, as you will see on the side, to our democracy. An Article 5 convention could blow up our entire Constitution. There are no guardrails. And in fact, I just put in the chat the entirety of Article 5. It's one sentence. Granted, it's a run-on sentence, but it's one sentence in our Constitution. So, Mia, could you go to the next slide? So, Article 5, as you see in the chat, it provides two methods to amend our Constitution. The one method we all know about, 2/3 of both houses of Congress agree on it. They send it to the states to ratify. We've done it 27 times. We understand that. There's also in there, you see that, or by conventions in 3/4 of those states. So what does that mean? What is an Article 5 convention? Well, we don't really know because we've only had one of them before. Mia, you can go to the next slide. We've only had one of them before. So as you see in what I put in the chat, all these questions that are not answered. For example, you guys are in Ohio. Y'all have kind of a big population. Do you want to have the same number of votes as Vermont does, as Wyoming does? Is it one person, one vote? How are the delegates going to be selected? I mean, Arkansas has passed a bill saying Convention of States members will be part of who we send to this. I mean, think about that. Are they going to start with our Constitution? Or as you see right here, are they going to completely rewrite it like they did last time we had a convention, which is when we got our current Constitution? I mean, they were sent to Philadelphia to ratify the Articles of Confederation. They sent little notes to each other before they get there. Don't tell nobody, but we're going to change this bitch up. And that's exactly what they did. They completely rewrote it. How many you see on there? Thank you so much, Mia. Again, we've never had it held. As you see on here, James Madison was like, this is a bad idea. Do we really want to do this? Do they have to be on the same subject? Mia, you can go to the next slide. This is one thing that I put in a little bit earlier than I usually do because I get called a fearmonger all the time on this. They're like, okay, Viki, calm down. Like, who cares if they call one, if they propose something super, super wild? Well, there's no way that 3/4 of the states are going to ratify that. Well, first of all, I say, wow, that's coming from a place of extreme privilege to think that you can play chicken with our Constitution. Kind of disgusting, in my opinion. But even if that weren't true, we have an old board member that used to say, why would you set your house on fire and then hope the fire department gets there in time? Because that's exactly what it is when you rely on the ratification process. Or as you can see on this slide, what if they change the ratification process? They did it last time. Why wouldn't they do it this time? Mia, you can hit the next slide. Oh gosh, that's gonna drive me crazy, y'all, with that first bullet point all askew. It would be absolutely undemocratic. Think about like, and we'll get to this in a minute, but I always think about the money in politics. Something that Ohio grapples with, something that New Mexico really grappled with when I was working here specifically for Common Cause. Think about the money. I always tell people, who do you think your legislature is going to send to a convention? Let's say every state gets 3 people. Do you think it's going to be a 27-year-old grocery clerk, a 45-year-old librarian, your school janitor? Absolutely not. We know who's going to go. It's going to be big money. Now, as bad as our disclosure laws are, they wouldn't even cover these guys. Think about that. Lobbying rules do not apply. You think about this, that it's the most undemocratic process ever. The amendment process, while flawed thanks to gerrymandering and voting laws being struck down around this country, at least allows the people to be involved. Mia, you can hit the next one. Again, I always, and this is from an old slide that David Super did years ago, but I always say, what would you think of? Like, would it just be like horse trading on the floor? Like Republicans, all right, we'll give you abortion if you give us guns. I mean, what would it be? We don't know, because these are unelected people that would be sent to that. Next slide, please. This is the biggest problem, is along with the no rules, is once a convention is called, as you can see by what I put in the chat, there's no role for anybody else in it. Once Congress calls it, Congress doesn't have a role in it. The president doesn't have a role in it. State legislatures don't have a role. In fact, we see state legislatures now passing bills. Y'all have one of them. We call them the prep bills, where they're saying, okay, if we call a convention, you better do what we say, or you're going to face jail time or some fines. Y'all, nobody cares about that. Our Constitution has been rewritten. Do I care that some raggedy ass man in Nebraska is going to spend $50,000? No, I do not. And most of them are 500. Next one, Mia. Again, the runaway convention is the biggest problem. We have all these different calls for a convention. We have the balanced budget amendment call. We have the convention of states call. We have the term limits call. We even have a call, as somebody put in the chat, to overturn Citizens United, something obviously Common Cause supports, but not this mechanism. So we do not know, once it gets called and once they get there, who knows what's going to come up? Who knows where it's going to go? Is it going to do like we did last time? And are they going to, again, just completely disregard the ratification process and change that? I mean, nothing is going to say, hey, let's do a simple majority on ratification. Thank you. Mia, will you hit the next one? So who's paying for all this? Like, who is invested in this? And this is a very tricky question, because a lot of this money is funneled through 501c3s, nonprofits, the kind that don't lobby, like your Humane Society. And so they constantly say, we're not lobbying. But again, this is coming from ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. The authors of Stand My Ground, voter ID laws, so many things. So next slide, please. This is a few of the pieces. And when you get these slides, the article is hyperlinked in there. But we are talking about Mark Meckler, the guy who started the Tea Party, Rick Santorum, former governor in Pennsylvania. As Catherine mentioned, Ron DeSantis, running all over the country trying to get people to do this. And Tim Dunn. If you don't know Tim Dunn in Texas, I suggest you Google him. He has so much money, just sold another company for, I don't know, $9 billion or something. And he's doing everything he can to rewrite our Constitution. Next slide. But we are not doing nothing. Before I hand it over to David, we are rescinding old calls for a convention. We are not only rescinding BBAs and hopefully some COSs, they're kind of new on the block, only been around 15 years, but we are
BBA,
rescinding,
COSs.
oh, Convention of States. Thank you. Sorry, Convention of States. The Mark Meckler Group, which, so we are rescinding. We are trying to get all of the old calls off the books. We have some from forever ago, y'all. We have some from hundreds of years ago. We have some BBA Balanced Budget Amendment. And I'm going to put some blurbs when David starts speaking in the chat on these different campaigns. Next and last slide for me, please, Mia. So what is going on in the country around Article 5? Well, as you can see here, and this is a typical year, I will let you know that this is about what we do every year, whether it's a long session or a short session. We see between 135 and 150 bills introduced. Luckily, this year we have no new Convention of States or balanced budget amendments. Term limits standing alone by itself, because please, who doesn't love a term limit? Except for Ohio. I love talking to Ohio about term limits. And the last thing I'll say is that quote on there by Mark Meckler. This is intended to reverse 115 years of progressivism. And that's not progressive as in what we talk about progressive in 2025. And we say, yes, it is. These guys want to completely rewrite our Constitution. And if you care about education, clean air and water, your body, your health, your ability to vote, your ability to do anything. I mean, they're trying to sell off our public lands. Y'all, these guys have been doing that for years. They've been salivating at this. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to put some info in the chat on the 3 top campaigns that are moving. And thank y'all so much. I can't wait to answer some questions later.
And we will make sure that we share information in the follow-up so that you have the information you need about the balanced budget amendment of the Convention of States, etc. Well, you'll notice that now Professor Super is highlighted, and this is the time I wanted to introduce him. He's an incredibly accomplished professor at Georgetown University. He is the professor the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law and Economics, which, by the way, sounds very fancy. But what is important is that he is going to talk to us about how he sees Article 5 and the threats and go over a good history. And so welcome, Professor Super. We're just really glad you're here.
Thanks very much for having me, and thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to join us. I want to do a quick history of these efforts to get an Article 5 convention called. The well-funded special interests, the moneyed groups that were some of the ones that Viki was just mentioning, have been at this a very long time. The Constitution stands in their way in a number of areas. And there also are things they'd like to get in there where their position is completely unpopular and they'd like to win. If people knew what they really wanted, we would keep the foxes far, far away from the chicken coop of our Constitution. And so this has been all about, next please, trying to come up with some rationale for a convention that sounds patriotic. These aren't foxes going to the chicken coop. These are patriots. They want a balanced federal budget. They want congressional term limits. They want to block tax increases. They want to limit federal power. Really anything that they can put out there that people will go for and will think, well, that sounds pretty reasonable. I want to do that. The whole point, though, is to get to an Article 5 convention. Next, please. once we get to an Article 5 convention, all of our rights are on the table. The First Amendment's on the table, equal protection, due process, presidential term limits. That is likely to be a big motivating factor for them. But also, and I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end, the authority of Congress to pass civil rights laws, environmental laws, consumer protection laws, or others are all going to be completely vulnerable once you have an Article 5 convention. So they can say it's for motherhood and apple pie, it doesn't really matter. During the 1970s and early 80s, they said they wanted to get a convention for a balanced federal budget. The deficits then were pretty puny compared to what we have now, but they still said it was too much. They wanted a balanced federal budget and wanted to call a convention supposedly for proposing an amendment to do that. And they came within a few states of getting there. Next, please. However, states, both liberal and conservative, realized what the Fox was up to and rescinded their applications for an Article 5 convention so that they wouldn't have to worry about runaway conventions harming basic liberties. This is conservative states, liberal states, the whole bunch of them. Okay, they came back in the 2000s. And again, they said, oh, we want a balanced budget amendment. We really do. They never really explained how this would work. If Congress passes an unbalanced budget, does the courts order tax increases? Do they decide what spending cuts to make? It never makes any sense, but they just gloss over that because this really isn't about a balanced budget. This is really about opening up our Constitution. So they came back in the 2000s. And soon afterwards, several other groups, Viki referred to some of them, showed up. You have the Convention of States Project. They want a three-part, they say they want a three-part amendment, fiscal restraint, limiting federal powers, and congressional term limits. Pretty vague, all three of those. U.S. term limits says they want a convention to impose term limits on Congress. And Wolfpack, a progressive group, says they want a convention to overturn Citizens United and reform campaign finance. So they try to get progressives on board as well. In some states, you see the Convention of States or balanced budget or term limits people cooperating with the Wolfpack people to try to get an application in. Because again, everybody knows that once you convene a convention, it's open season. It doesn't matter what you call it for. You can call a convention for motherhood and apple pie. You will still get the fox making a feast out of your chicken coop. Next, please. As Viki mentioned, this is very much tied in with a pretty familiar right-wing network. Mark Meckler set up the Tea Party. He became the acting CEO of Parler, right-wing social media entity, and he leads the Convention of the States and has for a long time. He's a very good fundraiser. This is a business effectively for the people who are pushing having a convention. Next, please. However, even counting the applications that were left over from the 70s and early 80s, this new effort in the 2000s to get a convention called couldn't get more than 28 states. I don't think those old applications should count, but even if they do, they never made it more than 28 states. And as Viki said, states, when they became aware of this threat, started rescinding their old 1970s, 1980s applications for a convention for a balanced budget amendment. So again, the fox was chased away. And as you see here, they have a lot of states asking for a convention for a balanced budget amendment, but they're well short of 2/3. They're still, they haven't even broken out of the 20s. Next, please. And the other groups have done even less well. The Convention of States Project has 19 states, not including Ohio. U.S. term limits has a dozen. And Wolfpack on campaign finance reform has only 3 states. That's just not going anywhere. three of the bluest states in the country. Convention proponents then said, okay, we can't get 34 states honestly, and they dug around in the archives and found 6 states had applications for completely unrelated things. New York in 1789 wanted a convention to write a Bill of Rights. We got one of those. Illinois, Kentucky, New Jersey in 1861 wanted a convention to avoid the Civil War. We got a Civil War. Oregon and Washington applied in 1901 for a convention for popular election of senators. You elect your senators. So these are all completely obsolete. Nobody who was involved in moving them is even still alive. But they said, let's count these old applications for utterly unrelated things along with this new application seeking a convention for a balanced budget amendment. They thought that was a clever idea, but again, we banished the fox because 5 of those 6 states with the ancient applications rescinded them. New York, Viki listed them, New York, Illinois, New Jersey, Oregon, and Washington all rescinded. So even if you play this completely dishonest math game, they only get 1 extra state out of it, leaving them far short of 2/3. Next, please. So now they're saying, well, maybe we don't have 34 states now and can't persuade 34 states, but we think Congress should count these 6 states with their ancient applications retroactively to 1979. And if you add the states that had applications for a balanced budget amendment in 1979 and these 6 states with the old applications for completely different things, that gets us to 34 states. They never explained why, if this is so clearly legal, they've waited literally decades to make the argument, or why someone like Trent Lott or Newt Gingrich or Ronald Reagan never made that argument, but they keep insisting that this is the way to go. They filed a lawsuit in Texas, McCall versus Pelosi, seeking an order compelling Congress to call an Article 5 convention. Next, please. Unfortunately, that didn't work out. The George W. Bush appointed judge who heard the case dismissed it on the grounds that the court lacked the power to issue that kind of an order. And frankly, the lawsuit was kind of a mess and could have been dismissed on a bunch of other grounds as well. But unfortunately, they're still working at it. The Convention of the States project that we've mentioned held a mock convention in August of 2023 to supposedly demonstrate how safe an Article 5 convention is. They then promptly disregarded the supposed limits in their own application, proving how safe an Article 5 convention isn't, and went on to address other things they didn't like about the Constitution that have nothing to do with their 3 purposes. And then they also proposed amendments that would render most environmental and civil rights laws unconstitutional. That would take effect within 2 years of ratification. So Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, TSCA, Endangered Species Act, whole bunch of those go away. Most of the civil rights acts that are most important, certainly Title VII, would go away as well. A few of each might survive on eccentric bases, but mostly they're getting rid of the authority Congress has used to pass our civil rights, environmental laws, and many others. They would force the government to divest itself of federal lands. Guess who would get those lands at fire sale prices? And they would limit Congress's ability to restrict environmental and economic harms from drilling and mining. They would allow a simple majority of state legislatures to overrule any federal law. and they would require a 2/3 vote of both chambers in Congress to raise taxes on the affluent. So if they were able to push through a big tax cut on the affluent, like they did this summer, it would become effectively unreversible, that all tax cuts for the affluent would become permanent in this model. Next, please. The convention proponents have very powerful people on their side. House Speaker Johnson pushed through an Article 5 application when he was in the Louisiana legislature. House Budget Committee Chairman Jody Arrington has repeatedly introduced a resolution asserting that they've met the 34 state threshold, or at least suggesting that, a resolution that would lead to an Article 5 convention. And convention advocates are now preparing another lawsuit filed by state attorneys general that would try to force Congress to call an Article 5 convention. Thank you.
And there were a couple questions that I thought would be helpful to ask. Can you explain how, like, you mentioned rescissions a couple different times. How does that work exactly? If a state decides to do that, how do they do that?
It's simply something that needs to be voted on by the legislature. It takes just a vote from the legislature to pass an application, and the legislature has the same power to pull one back, at least until a convention is called. So in the various states we're talking about, they just introduced something and it moved through. In Oregon, I think I'm going to get see that the Senate Democratic leader was the sponsor, and in the House Republican leader was the sponsor. Maybe I have those chambers backwards. And it moved through almost uncontested. It was unanimous in Nevada and some of these other states. You just put a resolution out there saying we rescind all past applications for an Article 5 convention, and vote on it.
How many states actually have an active call out there, and like how many states where the language actually matches?
There is some Article 5 application for something currently in 35 states. Only 28 of those even arguably are about a balanced budget amendment. And some of those have language in them that purports to prevent them from being aggregated with other states. But there's no particular reason to think that Congress would honor that kind of caution in a state application. If they get to 34, I think they're almost certain to disregard any language problems.
Well, thank you, David. We're going to move on to Franklin. Now, Franklin is with the Ohio Environmental Council, and I kind of love his job title, which is Director of Climate and Democracy Organizing, making that connection between the environment and what happens with our democracy. And so I'm very pleased to invite Franklin to join us and provide his thoughts about, well, wait a second, what does this actually have to do with the environment? And thank you, Franklin.
Indeed. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you, Catherine. It is always a pleasure to get to engage with you and Common Cause. I have quickly learned that if I follow those two entities, I will find myself getting to do good work. So thank you for the opportunity to do good work again. All right. Article 5 and climate. Can we go to the next slide, please? So forgive my poorly formatted slide. My comms team did not get to vet this slide before I sent it out. So you got college student Franklin. What this is a timeline that shows a shift over the last 18 years in environmental law at the federal level. So in 2007, in Massachusetts versus the US EPA, the Supreme Court ruled that the Clean Air Act granted the Environmental Protection Agency the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions as air pollutants. And so that decision significantly shaped the EPA's approach to climate change mitigation and served as a basis for most subsequent regulations. Then in between 2009 and 2013, there were several cases that addressed that authority, or the authority of environmental laws such as the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. And one example was the court considering the roles of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA regarding discharge permits and whether the Clean Air Act regulations displace certain common law claims. In 2014, there was a case, Utility Air Regulatory Group versus EPA, which limited the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from stationary sources. And then you fast forward to 2022, 2023, you have West Virginia versus EPA and Sackett versus EPA, which started to limit the EPA's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from first existing power plants and then narrowing the definition of waters of the United States under the Clean Water Act, limiting the EPA's jurisdiction over wetlands to those with a continuous surface water connection to other regulated waters, as opposed to shared groundwater, which was a huge, huge deal in terms of what constitutes a waterway and what is protected, what of our water is protected. And, in 2025, there's, multiple cases that are before our Supreme Court right now. The City and County of San Francisco versus the EPA, Severn County Infrastructure Coalition versus Eagle County, and the list goes on and on and on. And the reason that I speak about all of these cases is that for a large-scale shift to happen in our environmental laws, it took from 2007 to court cases that are now before the court, an 18-year span, right? Almost 2 decades. So to undo the work of a 2007 case has taken almost 2 decades. And so as you can see from this graphic, it was a long, winding, circuitous road to get there. It wasn't just a matter of these cases coming before the Supreme Court. There were federal elections at the presidential level and at the congressional level that had to be won to change the makeup of the United States Supreme Court to allow these changes in policy to be made. And so it was, again, something that happened over the course of almost 2 decades. Our system of government is designed for macro changes to happen slowly. So whether or not we agree with the policy, that long, winding, circuitous road is what our system of government is intended. What an Article 5 convention does is not straighten out this road. It's not make it an expressway. It changes the journey from going on this winding road to walking across the street. And in that amount of time, in 90 days, which is a drop of water in the bucket in terms of our system of government, we could be looking at a completely different system of government, as well as completely different way of dealing with and thinking about the environment. Now, I'm going to be quiet for a second. I want everyone to listen. This is the whole reason that I've been outside, that I'm taking this call outside. Now, I don't know if you could hear anything at all, but I'm surrounded by trees, by grass. There's squirrels playing behind me. Deer were running around a little bit earlier. Beautiful, clean air. And none of them have the ability to speak for themselves. They won't be present at an Article 5 convention. We don't know who the voices in that room will be. And so we cannot take it for granted that the people that are going to be there are going to advocate for all of these things that you see around me and that we hold dear, that we sometimes do take for granted. It's clean air that we breathe. As we've had reiterated over and over this evening, one of the primary organizations that is a driver of this work is the organization ALEC. Now, I don't want to get into my personal thoughts and feelings about ALEC. What I can say is that ALEC does have a energy, environment, and agriculture task force. They had a meeting of that task force this summer, just last month, July 18th. They discussed electricity policy, natural gas and pipeline policy, nuclear energy policy, agriculture policy, and then they had a presentation on nuclear energy activity in Congress. And that was the end. So, just based on their meeting agenda, it's very, very clear what forms of energy they prioritize: natural gas and nuclear. That's their words and their priorities. That's their agenda, not mine. Now, I do find it striking that with the leadership of that particular council is actually includes the senior director of state affairs at the American Gas Association, and it was previously led by an executive at AEP. And so, again, it's one of those things where you can see where the priorities are, and you can see what the strongest voices in the room are going. Sorry, I accidentally hit my mute. And yeah, and you can see what the strongest voices are going to be. And so, with that in mind, we have to be very, very careful and very, very deliberate about the way that we engage this work and how we sound the alarm about what is and what could happen. A lot of the environmental impacts that come out of such a convention, I do not believe will happen with the language of the environment or climate. I think that you will see something along the lines of more federalist considerations. Maybe, for example, language that establishes that states can't set more stringent requirements than the federal government, and or say that states are allowed to go below federal government requirements with no ramifications. Both of those things could hypothetically be included because they're not legally at odds with each other. You can't be better than the feds, and there's no problem if you go lower. And so it then becomes incumbent on the individual state to set those environmental laws, rules, and regulations. And that is not something that it has been demonstrated that we can count on every state to do in an effective, respectful, and responsible manner. The Article 5 convention in this environmental context hypothetically eliminates the ability of the government to protect it. And there is absolutely no limit to the things that they can do to harm it. What is not hypothetical is that the things, the entities, and even though it's not necessarily environment, most times the people that stand to be the most affected and harmed by the policies that can come out of such a convention will most certainly not be the ones most represented, whose voices are most represented in the room.
So one of the things that as I was listening to all of this, I thought, hey, this is a good point to have a conversation with Professor Super, that it would be lovely to hear, he's done some research, done some writing, thinking about how this would all come together. And before we invite Viki back, I'd love to hear Professor Super, I'd love to hear your thoughts and have you and Franklin have a little bit of a discussion.
Well, I very much appreciate Franklin's very thoughtful presentation, and I think that to me the key take-home point is that there are a lot of different ways that environmental protection can be gutted through an Article 5 convention, and we've seen the Convention of the States project, mock convention, propose one set of them, but you can, but I think Franklin may very well be right that there may be even worse things that would come in the real event, and that we can't be complacent about any of it.
Viki, are you feeling like you're ready to join us? And we'll start the discussion. And I thought one of the things that I thought would be worth starting with is this question. I got an email from Public Citizen wanting a convention to overturn Citizens United. It sounds like they're advocating for a convention. Why, it sounds like they're advocating for a convention is this the same thing as an Article 5 convention?
Thank you so much for that question. And that would be a new stance for Public Citizen. They support an amendment process. They have previously not supported a convention process, so I'm glad I already made myself a little note on that to check in with them tomorrow and to see if hopefully they maybe had a typo and were talking about the amendment process. But as Professor Super said earlier, we do have an organization that is pushing this through the Article 5 convention process. They picked up 5 states. We've rescinded 2 of those. So, and as Professor Super also said, they have been doing collaborations with the bad guys. They're literally introducing bills in Maine and several other states with the Citizens United and the term limits together. And just, Academy of States is what they've been calling themselves, this collaboration for the last several years. But I will definitely check up on that and hopefully have an answer for that before Jessica sends her email tomorrow.
All right, so David, Professor Super, can topics, participants, what they want to pass be negotiated before agreeing to a constitutional convention?
No, the convention, once it convenes, can by a majority vote set its own rules and decide what it's going to consider and what it's going to propose. I do think that it would be useful for us to have a discussion about ways to strengthen our Constitution. We've currently been getting a demonstration of some of its weaknesses, but that doesn't need to happen in a convention. Indeed, it shouldn't happen in a convention. If we have enough bipartisan support to ratify sound amendments, then we can negotiate them and get a 2/3 vote through Congress the same way we have in the past. Discussion, yes. Convention, no.
So one of the things that happened during the discussion had to do with kind of the big moneyed interests, what I would think of as kind of grass tops organizing to get a constitutional convention. Are you concerned that participants, if a convention were to come to pass, that there would be tons and tons of money spent, potentially situations that would verge on bribery? Do you have worries about the role of money in the convention?
Oh, enormous ones. As was mentioned, our financial disclosure laws right now are way weaker than they need to be, our money and campaigns. But this is a one-time chance for them to hit the jackpot. And the kind of money you see supporting legislation, the tax legislation last summer, which was very good, special interests, or other major special interest bill, will be chump change compared to the money that we put in this. Imagine what the coal or gas or oil industry or timber industry would give to have permanent constitutional protection against environmental laws. I mean, the sky's the limit to what they would pay for that. And imagine what the backers of a political party might give to have permanently locked in a procedure for choosing Congress that they can't lose. We're already seeing some of that with the gerrymandering efforts. So the amount of money that would be spent on this would be literally limitless. And that's why a lot of very thoughtful people across the political spectrum, Justice Goldberg, a liberal on the Supreme Court in the 1960s, Chief Justice Berger, a conservative starting in the 1970s, Justice Scalia, very conservative, starting in the 90s, have all said, no, 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 don't cross that bridge. We could lose our whole Constitution. And it's the money, it's a special interest that is the big issue. We escaped that in 1787. We won't escape that today.
And thank you for asking that, Catherine, because I think David brings up a really good point. While most of these campaigns that are pushing for this are hanging out with Alec and Rick Santorum and Ron DeSantis, the people opposing a constitutional convention are absolutely across the spectrum. And all you have to do is watch any of the hearings in Ohio, read some of the testimony in Ohio. We have some folks very far on the right. We have some moderates. I have people ask me, like, what Republicans support this? Are they MAGA? Are they? And it's really, you can't pinpoint it. It's not, people aren't monolithic to begin with, but it certainly isn't in this area. We have a lot of pro-gun organizations that are absolutely opposed to a convention because they're afraid they would lose the Second Amendment. And so the opposition is literally across the spectrum. Thank you for letting me jump in.
Well, and it's good to be able to have this kind of conversation. So one of this is an interesting one. Suppose we amend the U.S. Constitution, adding guardrails like limiting money in politics, adding more provisions that would strengthen democracy, enhance human rights. Would that process relieve the danger of an Article 5 convention?
I mean, I would love to see appropriate amendments that would strengthen democracy. That doesn't mean just my side wins, but that the people get to choose who wins. And I think there may well be, not at the moment, but within a couple of years, there may well be an opening for some negotiations to get us out of the current jam we're in with something like that. But it has to be negotiated. And if we simply call a convention, that's going to be a power play. As it stands right now, Republicans would have a complete hammerlock on it. I think they'd have 20, they control 29 delegations, another 4 would be split. So the convention would do whatever the Republican Party and Alec wanted it to do. You can imagine if there's a big wave election that Democrats might control a convention at some point. But either way, it's going to be a power play. What we need is a negotiation, and a convention is not the place to do that. That's a place for one side to ram through its views, and our country needs none of that.
So Franklin, here's one for you and me. This is a question about whether states are calling for constitutional conventions. So could Ohio actually call for a state constitutional convention?
That is a great question that I would actually have to get back to you to be sure of, because calling for a state constitutional convention, that would be a vehicle of the Ohio Constitution, and I don't know that one as well as the federal Constitution. So thank you for showing me a hole in my knowledge,
Well,
and I will
you
reach,
know what?
yeah,
When it comes to the
I'll let
Ohio
you.
Constitution, I think a lot of us have a little bit of a hole. So, David and Vicky, our Constitution, the state Constitution, goes back to 1912. We have cool things like direct democracy. But one of the things that happens every 20 years is voters get to decide whether or not we want to have a constitutional convention. And at the state level, we have avoided constitutional conventions as well. And we've had instead, like, the most recent one would be the Modernization Commission. So the last time there was a call was in 2012, and that's part of the Ohio Constitution. But it is interesting to think about, oh, wait a second. We're talking about we're talking about the US Constitution, but other rights, that are embedded in the state constitution, like our right to a decent, equitable public education, could be at risk if we got digging into that state constitution.
Well, and I'll just say, Catherine, this is a great question because like Ohio, there are many states that have that in their constitution. Now, I will say that, they say that either every 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, we will have a state constitutional convention. Most of those do not happen. They are voted down by voters, or they just literally don't happen. If folks are interested in that, the biggest battle that we've had in the last couple of years was Louisiana last year, where the governor was insisting on calling one, and he wouldn't even tell the legislature what he was going to talk about once he got there. And I'm talking, y'all, every nonprofit in the state worked together. I mean, I will make sure Jessica has one of their websites, because it's amazing the work that everybody, whether you were working on housing or democracy or health, it did not matter, because and he was stopped. Obviously, Louisiana is incredibly red. The governor is a very good friend of our president. And they really thought that this was his trial run. Like, let's see how this goes. And they were terrified because Louisiana does have a bit of a mess of a constitution, but they have a lot of protections in their constitution, just like you said. They have a lot of very specific tax codes that protect people in their constitution, and they fought him. They won. He got slammed at the polls, and then he tried to do it again, and the legislature, a solid red legislature, was like, we're not doing this. So we've seen this crop up, but we've also seen places like Alaska and New York and Rhode Island say negative also.
Well, we have almost come to the end. And so if Mia wants to pull up the slides, my last kind of question to ask you all is there any scenario where an Article 5 convention is actually a good thing?
The provision for calling an Article 5 convention rather than going through Congress was put into the Constitution for situations in which the overwhelming majority of the country wanted something and Congress wasn't willing to act. We're not in that situation now. If they stop having elections for Congress and we get the same Congress every single year without elections, then one might have to do it. But this literally is a break glass in case of emergency situation. And right now we don't have a consensus. I wish we did as to what kinds of changes we should make in our society, but we don't have that. So this would just be a special interest free-for-all.
All right. Well, I want to say a big thank you to our panelists, a big thank you to Viki Harrison. A big thank you to Professor David Super. A big thank you to Franklin Davis. I just am so grateful that we had an opportunity to think about what an Article 5 convention could mean, think about the real impact. I love Franklin when you were showing us the great outdoors. I think it's important to think about, our civil liberties and all of those things. But when push comes to shove, thinking about how an Article 5 convention could impact the air we breathe and our world, I think it's just incredibly important for us to think about what we can do to ensure there's a planet for our kids. All right, so what can you do? You can actually tell your state senator, state rep, to reject an Article 5 convention. We will send you a follow-up so that you have an easy link to send an email. I'm also going to encourage you actually to make a phone call. We are living in an era where what you want to do is actually make that phone call. Then I also want you to encourage you to visit, Viki, what's the name of your Defend Our Constitution? That's your
defendourconstitution.org, and we will make sure that's in the follow-up as well. It's a website we have that is nothing but Article 5.
And then if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to highlight some resources. We'll send them along. So including that defendourconstitution.org. We'll also send a couple recent articles as well as a piece by Professor Super. So you have an opportunity to look at that. I know that we did not actually get to everybody's question. So when we send the follow-up, feel free to send your questions in and we'll do what we can to answer them. All right, a big thank you to our sponsors. I can't tell you how much I appreciate people taking time to think about, well, how can we do this so that we can all get together, have an opportunity to learn more. And so with that, I'm going to say it's 7:01 and time to bid you all adieu. A big thank you again. Any final words from folks?
Thank you.